Welcome back to Comic Krackle. I'm your host, Kirby, and today we have the opportunity to talk about one of the books that have greatly impacted me for the reads of last year, and the editor that oversaw the restoration and additional aspects to get this book back into print. So I just wanted to extend the floor, introduce yourself, your previous experiences, your expertise in the comic book industry.
Sure. Thanks, Kirby. My name's Chris Robinson. I'm a writer, editor, comics enthusiast, reader. I, my career, comics wise, has been going on for some time now. I worked in the independent space for a little while, and then I worked at Marvel Comics for like 6 years, and then I floated around and I've done some editing for smaller companies since then. But I also do my own, projects, and one of those was All-Negro Comics 75th Anniversary Edition, which was a Kickstarter project that I did in 2022, and it was more successful than I imagined, because it was a project that meant a lot to me. But I was like, is anyone else going to care? And many people did, and I'm very happy about that. And we just released a soft cover edition of that book a couple of months ago in 25. So yeah, so it's become, yep, and you got a copy. So it's become um, a flag that I carry now, to make it, uh, uh, you know to add a spotlight to something that is a huge milestone, a very important piece of the industry lore. And it's a fascinating story, on its own. Every character, every person in it is like a character unto themselves, and I'm happy to talk about it with anybody that'll chat with me about it. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and being willing to talk about it. I, as I was going into it, I had never been privy to this book before. Orrin C. Evans, the entire creative team, but it was relayed to me by a friend of mine that had basically recommended the book, and they said, "Did you know about the Milestone comics before Milestone?" I said, "No," and that's how the book was pitched to me, and an all black creative cast creating books that represent them positively compared to the contemporary
Mhm.
comics of the time, and specifically targeting black comic readers. And
Yeah.
not being privy to that history, but when were you first introduced and aware of the book in Orrin C. Evans?
Yeah, no, I would say that I wasn't even, I it was a total happenstance, accidental. I've, like I said, I've been in comics professionally for a long time, but even before that as a fan. And I didn't even find out about it until, 2014, something like that, is when I first sort of stumble upon mentions somewhere, in Golden Age fan forums, that type of thing. So it was like totally an accident. And I had done, you know I would like to say that I had done my research. Like I was a fan of Golden Age and Silver Age comics, and the you hear about the big pillars, right? Marvel Comics #1, and Captain America comics, and #1, like, Detective Comic, like all the big milestone starts for the industry and these characters that we know and love today. But never heard about All-Negro Comics #1 until I was doing my own research, and I had to, once I heard about it, then the journey of like, okay, where do I see this? How do I find a copy? And it's like, oh, it's not to be found. It's not a thing that is just readily accessible, and certainly not readily accessible in a format that I think is uh, um matches its importance. There's like really, water damaged copies out there and scans and, beat up. And I mean, it is from 1947, so it is quite old. So, but like I said, some of the other comics I mentioned, you can find a copy of Marvel Comics #1 right now and be able to read that easily, and I'm sure tons of different formats. But yeah, this one did not have, what makes it unique is that it doesn't have like a corporate overlord like continuing to like squeeze money out of it essentially.
Mhm.
So the fact that it's the public domain project, or it's fallen into the public domain, means it's sort of like not exploitable in the same way. But just from a historical importance to me as like someone working in the industry and trying to find, you know, those important indicators that like we belong in the industry. Like obviously you already mentioned it, but I was already a huge fan of Milestone Comics, very big into that. Um, Christopher Priest, Jim Owsley, like his whole uh, um, journey, into the industry was always fascinated by him. Larry Hama, not black, but definitely a trailblazer in terms of like being the representative in the office to and the comics offices to you know consider other viewpoints and that sort of thing. Women, plenty of women out there who also blaze the trail. But yeah, but Orrin C. Evans, when I heard about him, like I was blown away because it predated any of these other folks that I'm talking about. So yeah, so it became a little bit of like a personal mission to like look into him, find out more, dig up what I can, see who else is in the space, like keeping this history around, and it resulted in this book.
And I will say that it's it struck a nerve with me in a positive sense. Uh, while I was going through it, just with the depictions of how black protagonists are shown, with the Dick Tracy aspect of Ace Harlem and
Yeah,
the Tarzan, of Lion Man. Like the
sure.
archetypes are played with, but it's never in a way that is demeaning. And if it is utilizing some aspects of caricature that were prominent at the time with, white publishers taking predominance, they're able to play with it in a way that is including you in on the inside joke. And I was in love with it. And then it wasn't until the story, the two-page prose story,
Mm.
that I was just captivated by the level of prose and the forethought to include that as an aspect of this comic book, and saying, okay, you want gritty detective story, we have Ace Harlem. You want kids fairy tale, we have the Doodillies. If you
Mhm.
want action adventure, really the archetype for what Black Panther would be, we have Lion Man. And then this prose story that comes completely out of nowhere, and I'm reading it like it's a thriller, and I'm like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh, this is so great. And including that, where I wouldn't have imagined the prose being included at the time. Typically, at 40s, reading some of like the Joe Simon, Jack Kirby books, overly wordy narration that takes up half the panel. But including that, I loved how it was trying to cast the widest net and saying there's something here for everyone, and we are going to tackle that market. And
Yeah.
so whenever you were going about reading these for the first time, which was the story that stood out to you in particular?
Hmm. I mean, I was always, you know, shocked, right, at the Black Panther Lion Man comparison because Lion Man predates Black Panther by 13 years, 15 years, something like that, and
Yeah.
um, they're pretty one to one. Like they're very similar, like in a way that you're like this feels if they were still pursuing it at the time, it's like, oh, this feels like a copyright issue. Um,
Yeah.
but so yeah, that one jumped up like right out of the gate. I think I am impressed by what you're talking about in terms of like it had something for everyone, and that's something didn't happen by accident. Orrin Evans mentions this in his introduction letter at the beginning of the issue, that it was for the whole family. Like it was a magazine, in the sense that they used to be on the newsstands right next to everything else that encompassed entertainment at the time, right?
Mhm.
Um, I think I think, and then we there's also some like one page stories in there, short features that are also pretty funny, that we haven't mentioned, and but it added to a really nice package, especially I when 2014 I was like getting into editing
Mhm.
comics for the first time, and so that was sort of something I took with me in terms of like, when you do an anthology, that how can you set it apart? And it's like these extra features, these extra, it's not just having 10 stories, it's like having 10 stories, and then a couple of one pagers, or some text, whether it's a letter column, or reaching out to the audience in a different way. Activity pages was like something I used to do in Marvel Comics when I was editing those types of stuff. So, I think the form factor was like, was not lost on me at the time.
Mhm. And I hadn't even mentioned the like one page gags. I
Hmm.
really appreciated the fashion aspect where it's just like here's a quick panel, like just four panels, here's just jokes that we're throwing out, and then uh Lil Eggy, which
Yeah.
like the suburban like I almost felt like it was playing up a type of archetype that this is like, Urkel if he grew up, right?
Sure.
And I was just like getting a kick out of it, and it's like there's just something here that is broad and encompassing and inviting, that I knew that it was something different and standing out at the time. I mean, obviously,
Yes.
the majority of comic book fans, if they start out in, modern reading, they start working their way backwards. So I've
Mhm.
read, the 40s and 30s, 50s, everything. And so comparing that to the traditional storytelling of the time, I was just blown away. And there's aspects of like almost fourth wall breaking.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that aspect where it's like you can tell that even for this, this very small magazine, they were breaking the confines of the definition. Like all of the other guys, they're backed by larger corporations, large
Hmm.
publishers. We are going to do something different. And I always love that aspect of a underdog story that's rising up. And I not to um you know compare like comics into a different medium, but I would love to see the story of Oren C. Evans in, on the big screen, and just talking about that process. And I could feel like that is a part of history that I want to have documented. And with the characters and everything being in the public domain, possibility for that happening would be likely. But I feel like this underground uh, comic magazine that was starting out, it just came out the gates with an express purpose. And while I was doing research on Oren C. Evans, reading into how the articles that he was publishing
Yeah.
inevitably led to the practices of segregation in the military to be thrown away. And I was stewing on it for a little bit, after reading that, and it's like yeah, at the time, of course, like we're we have segregation in our military, but we're supposed to be be fighting for freedom of everyone. And it's like,
Right.
yeah, the person that is pointing out the irony, and like, you guys are hypocrites. Like, you want to impart American idealism to others, but you're not focusing on yourselves and the forces that are going out. You're still discriminating. And
Hmm.
I just thought that it was so fascinating, and being able to handle those topics because I had no idea. And
Yeah.
I just, I love this book, and the more that I read about Orrin C. Evans, the more I'm just fascinated on a creator's level, where he was able to, enact actual change through
Hmm.
his articles, and then
Yeah.
once being let go, decided to move for comics, which I thought I didn't think that that was, like a transition at the time,
Sure.
and it's outside of the realm,
Yeah.
but being able to go. So I know, given the history, Orrin C. Evans what wasn't trying to be conspiratorial. However,
Okay.
the book never got a second issue.
Sure.
What is your opinion on the reason why that is?
Yeah. I mean, you know, Orange before do get into speculation, like Orange C. Evans, fascinating guy. Just like before you even bring up the comic part of
Mhm.
it, which we as comic fans obviously like zero in on, but like prior to that, hugely important. Breaks the color barrier in the newsroom. You already mentioned the Army segregation article, which went really wide. One of the first uh, like NAACP honorees. So like he's a hugely he's a as an overlooked figure that is fascinating for a lot of reasons. And he as part of what do you call it? His newsroom goes on strike, right?
Mhm.
And for better working conditions. And then instead of working with the striking reporters, the paper gets shuttered. So he loses his job, and like as you mentioned, he sort of is you know uh, uh, he's like, what do I do next? And then he gets into comics because he sees the impact it has on kids, essentially the whole family, right?
Yeah.
Mom, dad, kids, comics is for everyone at that time, uh, um, to more of a degree than it becomes later on in history, right? Um, but yeah, I think sorry, let me take that again. So he does he does so he sees how important comics are, and he also sees how bad the stereotypical portrayals are. The black characters created by white talent are
Mhm.
at the time terrible. The one I always point to that is a documented at the same time as Steamboat from Shazam,
Mhm.
right? So pretty racist character, and so racist that even people in the 40s were like, "Hey, can you please stop this?" So, like there's that was like a character that was boy had a lot of letters written about him to Fawcett, right?
Mhm.
Anyway, so basically, finding this hole this hole in the marketplace for, hey, if we treated black characters with the respect and wealth of variety that exists in real life, you might be able to make some money. So I like did he do it for totally, there is like a commercial aspect to this stuff too,
Mhm.
it's a comic that he priced more than the standard cost of a comic at the time was like a nickel, 10 cents maybe.
Yeah.
This was 15 cents. So he immediately puts a premium on this experience, and the comic, you'd be surprised. It sold. There were a lot of copies at one time. There were a
Really?
lot of copies at one time, but yes, but the newsstand union, and once people received the issues, because it wasn't, there was no internet, there was no pre anything, like you got your orders from the distributor, and it's just there it is. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
They didn't know what they were getting, sort of, until they got it. So getting the comic, getting All-Negro Comics #1, it became pretty clear, in certain territories, like, oh, this is not what we thought this was going to be, more like the current fare of the time, and it wasn't. It was respectful and unique in that, and so they started taking issues down. So that's why it's like, uh, um, that's why it's so rare. Not because there weren't, like, it wasn't there wasn't interest. There was definitely interest. It's just there were industry reactions from the, like, incumbent industry uh, powers that be, I guess, at the time, in terms of, like, the newsstand union, and literally, I'm talking about literally the folks, getting the, like, bundled up, bundle tied uh, stacks of copies and putting them out, and so a lot of those were just, like, taken down and gotten rid of, and then the problem doesn't, that is sort of, not great, right? But it still could have probably maybe continued. But then after that, when there was already work done on a second issue, and they were lining up the printing for, because it was supposed to be a recurring comic. There's, like, even an
Hmm.
ad for the second issue, for the following issue, at the back of the only one that exists. Um, the paper mill in the area, this was the Philadelphia area, would not, so this was a Pennsylvania paper mill, wouldn't sell them any more paper to print the issues. So, unfortunately, like, those, whatever would have been #2 is, like, lost to time, right?
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, there was. I think, again, it's not. Comics is a something that Oren is coming to fresh. Like, he's not. You know what I mean? Like, he's not a. It's not like he started a newspaper, right? He started
Yeah.
a comic company. So I think that is also maybe one of the factors into why we don't see much, because it's sort of like he goes back to news after this. You know what I mean? So
Hmm.
he has sort of, other ways to get his voice out and speak. But yeah, you know I guess that is something that sort of is, unfortunately, kind of parallels our present day, where there's sort of, an incumbent, um, uh, you know um, uh, you know, there are. I would say that there's, a there's folks. The industry has sort of its stalwarts, who are sort of setting the tone, and it's not always super accepting or inviting to new voices.
Hmm. No,
Yeah,
and I mean, that's what I can feel that it registers throughout that time. I mean, obviously there were more companies sprouting up out of nowhere, some with more backing than others. And I think that aspect of, like, DC consolidating around National and everything, and then Atlas Comics making the transition over into Marvel, I think that time is well documented from those perspectives. And I think just shedding light on this one magazine that didn't go forward, but just like a encapsulation of the market at the time,
yeah,
and whether there were additional factors at play, with it targeting an all black audience. I
sure.
just I think that's so interesting. But I also had a question. Whenever I was getting around to reading it, what was the restoration process like? When did you know that you wanted to pursue restoring this book for consumption in the modern day?
Yeah, it was. Well, let me like a very slight distinction because
Mm,
restoring is like a process. If we had the original boards, like the
yeah.
actual art, this is more of like a remastering. It's digital,
Mm,
so we only, there are copies out there in certain high value collection, closed collections. We had access to scans that I worked with Tony Washington, who's this incredible illustrator, colorist. He does music too. He's like a really quadruple talented guy. And so we had scans of the issue, and we were like, we want to make it uh, palatable to people today.
mm,
So, this that didn't mean, make it look brand new. I think, there are plenty of uh, remastered or, reprinted Golden Age comics out there today that, you know, kind of, I don't, you'd have to talk to the people who put those books together, but they
mhm.
sort of like look different than I think what was intended. I think
Yeah.
it doesn't embrace those projects don't embrace what is they don't embrace their age, and we wanted to embrace the age and just not run away from the fact that, like, this is an old comic, and we used a sort of like an aged paper effect that's like the base layer, and then Tony went in and using what we had, grabbed all the blacks, so he pulled all the blacks out, so all the line art, um, uh, you know, uh, uh, very slight retouching. Again, we didn't want to add to anything.
Mhm.
We wanted to just take what was there and just make it, like I said, palatable to be able to read today and feel complete. So if there was like a corner taken out of something, we might have, or he might have like cobbled it together from a different scan, that type of thing. But anyway, the colors after the blacks were relayed in and sort of amplified. He brought in the colors, and that has a lot of like grain in it that again is from the scans. Like, there's some touch ups in terms of like if there was fading or water damage or something like that, that wasn't from the original printing. We corrected that stuff, but yeah, it was a very delicate, very we thought a lot about it, and we had a lot of conversations about like what looks good to us, and
Mhm.
what do we want to go forward here, um and yeah, I think in the beginning, when I was like originally, so I didn't do this project until like 2000 or 2020, like 2020, something around there.
Mhm.
Was when I started getting back into like figuring out how to do it. But I had the idea in 2014, and at that point I was like, oh, we should just do a reprint, and then just to make it available, accessible, all that stuff. But it wasn't until um, so early, so like that is sort of like the base. When I start getting into like, okay, what does it mean to remaster? Because I'm by trade, I'm not a uh, um, comics historian, I would say. I've
Mhm.
sort of become one on this one specific book in the interim. But at the time, I was sort of like learning things like the difference between remastering and restoring, and how would you track down the boards and the original art. And it's like you're probably never going to find those.
Mhm.
So that's not an option. So it was sort of like taking what was available, and taking the hoops, or taking where playing the ball where it's laid, and like working from there to fulfill the original my original goal, which was to make this thing, to put a spotlight on a piece of history that people have forgotten about. Just like you know, there's plenty of classic, how many different interpretations of like the Invisible Man, or that those types of like class, H.G. Wells stories or whatever. This was sort of like that, and to me, in terms of like, you know, we can just have it available. But and so that was the first stop for me. But then, once I started putting the book together, and like I said, there's this big gap between when I had the idea to when I like executed. I had a lot more editing experience by the second time I pick it up. So that's when I'm like, oh, if we're gonna do this, like, how do we make this a little bit more involved? And that's where the ideas for the essays and new stories with the characters, all that
Mhm.
stuff. That was that's something that came later.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Well, and that's I love the distinction between restoration and remaster because I
yeah,
was blown away with how it's depicted, that the paper that it's printed on, and it doesn't lose the authenticity from the original print compared
yeah,
to, other editions of older works where they're recolored with modern coloring techniques and
yeah,
put on just like normal white paper. And I loved that aspect because it kind of just like made it feel like I was reading that physical copy, and like the paper quality. And it's not something that I usually take notice of. I feel like, the vast majority of modern publishing, you don't notice it until it's changed.
right,
And uh specifically as a reader.
right,
But seeing that it's changed and seeing how that plays to a better adaptation and remaster of the original work, I I just really enjoyed, and I was just blown away that it's like the idea and conception of that idea to restore in that way, and it being, it's a couple extra steps, right? And compared to modern practices, and just taking the time and dedicating, and that kind of focus to retaining authenticity, was it just spoke to me throughout the entire time reading the book. But you had talked about the additional matter and
yeah.
additional stories. What was the process like, recruiting the creators to come over? Did you already kind of have like a good idea for who you were going to bring in for which character, or generally just recruiting based on the creators that you already had like in the Rolodex?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, some of them definitely were just folks you could see I work with them all the time.
Mhm.
Ray Anthony Height, me and him used to do Marvel stuff together. Um, Tony, I had met through Marvel as well. Um, some other folks, and those guys are sort of, have decades in the industry, but I also wanted to expand. Like I always want to work with new folks. Micah Peters is a essayist, I guess you might say.
Mhm.
He's he's a pop culture writer, and he was asking me about how do I try my hand at comics. So I gave him whatever pointers I could, and this is his first time writing a comic. Really, really great job. Um, Zipper Smith. I forget, I met her at another job I was working at the time, and she was in the Milestone Initiative
Mhm.
from 2021 maybe. I don't remember off the top of my head when that was happening, but that's pretty cool, and that's in definitely in the spirit of the book for sure. So that was she you know was someone great to bring on. um at the time I was also doing um I was working a lot in like the web comic,
Mhm.
vertical comic space, in my professional life, or at
Mhm.
my for a job at the time. And so I met a lot of webcomics creators and who had like crazy different, very anime or manga influenced styles. And I'm like, if we're doing this update thing, that should be part of it. I think, I don't know that, I never came to this and was like, we should do new stories in the style of the old ones. They're in the spirit of the old ones, but
Mm.
they're for today, right?
Yeah.
Um, so that was how I ran into Jasmine and Shireen. And then Darren Bennett wrote one of the stories, the Sugarfoot and Snake Oil, who are like a Laurel and Hardy,
Mhm.
grifter comedy duo. Um, funny guys. Anyway, so Darren and I had met through comics. He had been lettering tons of comics throughout my career, and was getting into writing, and so he wrote one of those. Um, Domo Stanton I had also worked at Marvel with, and he had ended up doing some DC stuff in the interim, so wanted to bring him back. And then Ryan Marlowe. So at the time, so Ryan Marlowe drew one of the one-page stories. I was doing, I was doing these sort of, um, I don't know how to phrase this. Like I was doing classes, like I was teaching comics to people who wanted to get into comics, and so we were doing one of these summits. It was me and a bunch of other creators. I was doing one of these summits in Alabama, of all places, and so Ryan, came, was one of the kids. Or he's not a kid; he's a grown man. One of the guys in the classes, and he was showing me his portfolio, and he's just like, the whole point of the event was sort of to like break down barriers for folks in
Mhm.
terms of like you have talent but don't understand, uh, you know, the industry part of it, whatever that could mean. Um, so I looked at his portfolio and he was like very talented. So I gave him whatever pointers I could, and a one-page story is a great place to start. So he did a little Eggy story. Um, but yeah, these were folks that I either I felt like their voice would be use would add to what we were doing here. I didn't want it to just be one note in any direction.
Yeah.
Um, and then the essays. I don't want to pass over that stuff. The essays
Yes.
were super awesome. Kiana Whitted is a doctor, a professor rather, and who also a doctor, but who knows this space extremely, like very like she's the you know the name in this sort of on this topic. Her book, Desegregating Comics, is also fascinating, and it has the essay her essay that appears in this comic in All-Negro Comics is a sort of like a truncated sort of like simpler way, simpler version of an essay that's much longer that appears in that Desegregating Comics book that I'm talking about.
Mhm.
Um, and then Sean Pryor and David Brothers. Those are just guys I admire. Sean I had met um, through comics. He had done he was a writer, writing in comics, and I'd read his stuff, and so he was a voice in terms of like what it's like working in the industry today that
Mhm.
I wanted to get, and then David Brothers also now writes comics, but he was a another pop culture writer, and I wanted to get his voice again. I just admired how he thought about comics and characters and their place in the world in our personal worlds, and so I asked him if he had a take on any of these characters, and he said he had something that he'd been looking for a place to put, but could never find the right place. And here's a perfect place to talk about these characters. So he was able to put something down, just talking about like again the discovery. So the way there's the three essays. There's Kiana's talks about literally the history, like it's the longest essay, and it literally just has the facts of the time and how the book came together.
Mhm.
Um, David's is in the middle, and it's sort of like the discovery, the present, and then Sean's, it's the last essay. It's sort of the perspective of like his outlook on the comics industry, and that's sort of the one that's meant to look forward. So that
Mhm.
was my thought process on why these essays and why these people and all that stuff. So
No, and I greatly appreciated it. I feel like as as I grow older, I love the perspective and additional content that are put into the books. So the word of mouth, the oral history of
yeah.
how things are created, but then also the think pieces that
Mhm.
it just really resonated with me, where I was not only, able to read the original stories, but then also getting the original context for the history and how it impacted those that had the passages at the time. It was very, very appreciated. But then on top of that, the thing that just put a smile on my face was at the back the discussion guide and the recommended reading. That is something that I'm always asking for, deeper avenues and being able to explore beyond just the confines of, the one individual book. If you broach a topic, I want to be able to read more on it, and the discussion aspect really lends to, distributing this far and wide and keeping the level of communication and the aspects that you had hit on very early in the book of making sure that people know about the history, discussing this, and passing this on to somebody else is also evident in the Kickstarter campaign. And I had seen the one for you, one for them aspects, and getting those to people that are in prison or schools, and being able to contribute in that way. um, I really appreciate this, not only from the comics aspect, but just African American history that is not highlighted enough, and the impact that it can have, and how the generations coming up now are able to dive into the further research and development of these ideas, so we're not losing that to time. um it's definitely an aspect that was it spoke to me in a way that I just, not saying I want to give away my copy, but I finished it and I was like, I need to get this. I need somebody else to read this. I need to, like,
Yeah.
let my friend borrow it or tell people to buy it. And that was an aspect of me wanting to do a video on the book, is just I need to shout it from the rooftops that people should be getting it whenever they can. And having the minor platform that I do have, I love, being able to retain that history and getting it out there, and we can have an open discussion on, the impacts of this book and the impacts of African American comic creators that are in the space from the 70s, 80s, 90s today, and how comics wouldn't be the same
Yeah.
if those creators didn't have that voice, and let's, propel them. And I think in the something that I wasn't thinking about at the time, whenever I was reading the additional and new stories, is that we get this almost like a snapshot of where these characters would be if issue 2 was able to continue. And
Yeah.
I then it started this, like, this thought experiment of, how would these characters look in the 80s? How would these characters look in the 90s? What if, Dwayne McDuffie was able to pick up these reins and move forward with these characters? Would we still have a milestone? And instead, if he was able to pick up these characters and tell those kind of stories, what would the cultural landscape look like if the book was able to keep on going? And
Yeah.
I just I really appreciated, you were talking about the diverse voices of coming from different aspects of comics and outside of comics, and just rallying all of these people and creatives around this slice of history and getting unique takes that are outside of the norm that we would get. I just I I feel like I'm a broken record where I just say it's so fascinating. I love it. It's so interesting. But I mean, just honestly, I haven't been this excited once I read a book and invigorated to get this out to somebody else. And
Sure.
I love that aspect. So I
Thank you.
do
Yeah.
appreciate.
Yeah, it's it is it's a book that is sort of made to be shared. The edition that I did on Kickstarter, just for the economics of like, I'm just a guy and I'm not printing that many copies. It was a it was kind of expensive, and it was also a hardcover. Um, but and I was happy to do that, and I was happy to, and thank you for mentioning the donation program that we ran. We donated. I think the final tally was like 470 something, and I just rounded up. So we ended up sending out 500 copies to different libraries and schools and uh, penal correctional programs and things like that all over the place. So that was awesome. People really supported that. But then after that, it was like, how do I get this out there more? And uh, the soft cover through Image that you held up a few minutes ago, like that is it's $12, right? So it's like that's the if you're at a shop and you're curious, if you're like, what's that? I feel like that's not an amount that people think that would think too hard about sometimes. So that was like, and also, it's in Hoopla and other, library apps too. So like, call, check on there if your literal local branch doesn't have it, but you can also just ask them and they can figure out, order it somehow and get it to you guys, get it out there. So it's very super. The accessibility is like through the roof now, which is great. But yeah, then after the accessibility is we've done that work. We have the work of telling people about it, and as loud as life is today, you can't be just saying, turning to a friend of yours and saying, "Do you know about this book?" Or "Do you know about this piece of history?" Um, and you know I think it's so compelling, all the people involved and the characters are compelling, like that you don't need to press it too hard. I think if somebody's when they find out about it, they're like, okay, that's on my list or whatever, however they go about that. But it's yeah, it was, I think I mentioned this earlier, but it's like, the part of the reason why these characters are not known the world over yet, right, is that they do not have a corporate interest like pushing to get them on every to put them on every continent and make as much merchandise and whatever other exploitation means exists, right? There uh, uh I would would there would I would love for there to be a Lion Man movie, right? That would be super cool. But like, they who would do that today? I mean, I don't know. We're probably going to see a multi-award winning Frankenstein movie in a
Mhm.
few months, right? So who knows? Maybe there is life for a public domain character to get that sort of adaptation look, but um, you know, I don't think we probably won't have we're not going to have that conversation unless you and I continue to talk about it here, here and now, and people find out about these characters on the ground floor, and um, you know, even though and that's what I'm doing with my time now. So the book is published and it's out there, and it's available, and I'm happy to I love talking about it in formats like this with you, Kirby. But like I also am interested in I'm developing a documentary, sort of a long form documentary about this as well, because that is a way that people there's going to be a section of the audience that are just not going to interact with a book, and it's like, great, here we have made this doc for you, so interact with it that way.
Yeah. No, and that's deeply fascinating. I feel like, you know, sometimes there's aspects of comics that feel a little like protected,
Mhm.
where people say, I'm not going to pick up a comic book, those are for kids. So
Sure.
I always have a difficulty in like handing something off. And with my wife in particular, she has her books, she reads her books, and it's every once in a while I'll just hand her something and just say, I want to talk about this with you. Please read this. And the only times that it's been successful have been with this book, and then also It's Lonely at the Center of the Earth by Zoe
Mm,
Thorogood. And
yeah.
two Image comics where I'm like, don't got to worry about superheroes, don't have to know anything else. These are the books that are just so gripping, and I can't explain the feeling that I have until you read this. And I love that aspect, and I feel like some of the reason that I uh, wanted to make videos is highlighting uh, the the portions of comic history and the creators in comic history that might not be spoken about, or how can we look at this through a different lens. And those are the aspects that I always come back to, and wanting to pay homage in my certain kind of way, but get that kind of discussion out there. And that's just something that I've really been appreciative of this book for. And I know you had said about the documentary, and I am very excited. And what would you like to see outside of the documentary for this book moving forward, and the characters within?
Um, this is a great question. So, me personally, I am more fascinated with the real story, the story behind the story. I want to know more about the people that all the incredible folks that worked on it. We know the names of some of the folks who did the actual comic, right? But we don't have all the information about, like, Lawrence Evans didn't do this by himself. There was, it was like a little company. Like, it had that
Mhm.
he worked with other folks that he knew from the newspaper world, and were helping him out. Like, one of them was his old uh, Philadelphia Record editor, Harry Saylor, who's
Mhm.
who's a white guy who, like, was sort of like, not the face, but sort of like helping him get things done on that side, using that privilege to help out the production as well. So I think it's totally fascinating. I think the real story is the more fascinating thing to me. However, these characters are, um, they are, you'd be they are, they're definitely of the time, of the era, and all that stuff, but they're pretty um evergreen, in a way that you would kind of be surprised. Like, like we've already mentioned, Lion Man is basically Black Panther, and people seem to be digging, are Lion Man, or sorry, Black Panther fans right now, right?
Mhm.
Um, Ace Harlem is a detective. Like, detective stories never go out of style. Um, the doodlies, cherubic. I definitely see like a fun animated, thing with them. I would love to see anybody pick up the ball with these characters, and that is sort of the beauty. Anybody can, you know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like, it's a we it's all it belongs to everybody in that sense. So, you know, people reach out to me, or sometimes I'll get comments places, whatever, where people are like, oh man, I just found out about, such and such, Ace Harlem, whoever, whatever character, and it's like I'm gonna write my own, uh, uh, you know, Ace Harlem fan fiction or whatever. But it's not even fan fiction. It is that is your Ace Harlem story. You know what I mean? The same way
Yeah.
people have been telling Sherlock Holmes stories, for years and years and years, right? So, um, and I love that. I want people to want to do that because that is part of the evangelizing. The evangelizing is creating new stories with them. Um, I have pitched to a couple of publishers, like like sort of essentially, like what if we how do we what if we rebooted these characters again, that type of thing. And it's there's always some interest, but like, you know the um the economics of anthologies, and again, these characters that you can't really own
Hmm.
is sort of off-putting to money making entities, which I get. I'm not I work on that side of I get it. You know what I mean? I understand how the industry works. So it's not something that I'm like, I don't. Nobody wants to do this weird charity anthology that I keep pitching. So it's like, but I don't know, man. Like, I think in time, whether you're having a conversation about the fictional parts of this book or the nonfiction parts of this
Hmm.
book, it's all grist, and it will add to the legend. You know what I mean? The
Hmm.
legend that is also reality. So,
Yeah.
uh, you know, I encourage, if you're watching this and you're hearing my voice and you're like, you know in any way sort of inspired by this conversation, like, in plenty of people, and I'm guilty of this too, have like their take on Frankenstein, their take on, all these other public domain characters. Like, want to give one of the All-Negro Comics characters a spin.
Hmm. No, I love every aspect about it, and I love that, the aspect of focusing on the history, um, and the real life history, as well as, hoping people take up this as an opportunity to tell more stories, with these characters, but also keeping the stories of the creators alive. Um, just because, I mean, they all have their artistic merit, and they're just so well defined, and I wish that we were able to see them continue working from that point, and able to actually enter the comics industry, um, in the main line. I want to see where these careers go. So I really do appreciate that. I had one thing that I wanted to ask you before we
Sure.
left, because I saw it noted, and I'm going to be doing a video about it,
Mhm.
probably after this one, about the correlation between comics and hip hop music.
Mhm.
And I had seen that you had worked with Vince Staples to
Mhm.
do a comic collaboration aspect. So I just wanted to get your take about why you think the relationship between comics and hip hop music is so strong, and they share some aspect in DNA.
Yeah. Um, yeah, no, comics and hip hop go way back for me. I was, obviously I grew up in New York. I'm from Queens, so, from the from a young age, I was like, deeply into hip hop, and everyone around me was into it. Not so much my mom and dad. They were
Mhm.
not into. They prefer that I not listen to that stuff. But um, uh, I would say that there's a it's all storytelling, right? Like the storytelling of comics and the storytelling of hip hop. Larger than life characters, most of the time underdogs. Building um, their own myths. You know what I mean? It's like the internal myth making of this character or this the rap persona. A lot of rappers have certain personas that isn't you know depending on who you talk to, that close to who they are in real life anyway.
Mhm.
um you know Comics, hip hop, wrestling,
Mhm.
these are all things that share a lot of the same impulses. um so you see a ton of crossover in the fandoms, right?
Mhm.
um I had worked on, I don't know if you remember this, but Marvel had a very long running hip hop variant cover program, where we did like 180 something, 190 something different comic covers based on album covers.
Yeah.
So that I worked on those, almost, like 90% of those, directly. Um, but that was, hard. We did hardcovers. We did some. Eventually, the variant cover art ended up on real record, like real vinyls.
Yeah.
Which I was like, this is weird Aurora Burroughs stuff here happening here, but okay.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, hip hop is awesome, and you mentioned that Vince Staples book. That was interesting. That was like, he had a concept that he wanted to develop as a comic, and you know he gave me like a premise. He started with like a premise and certain plot points, but he didn't have all the dots connected. So I just sort of like added to, and like, here's a bunch of characters that speak to the themes that you want to hit, and that was a really awesome experience. And Buster Moody drew the hell out of it, did a really great job with it. Um, I worked on a Czarface book. I don't know if you're familiar with
Mhm.
Czarface, but
Yep.
Seamus, who as is esoteric, who pretty much the driving force of Czarface as a character, um, as a group and as a character, was working with him was super awesome. But yeah, no, they're sort of tangled up in each other because of you know they speak to the same sort of primal thing, right? And they people who love rap generally love comics and vice versa.
Mhm.
um so yeah, very very overlapping diagram there.
Yeah. And you were talking about the Marvel hip hop crossover variant covers. That very funnily was one of the reasons that I went into the comic shop as like a young adult. I was
Okay.
in high school and I was obsessed. I would, all I listened to was different
Mm.
eras, ranging from like Tupac to Tyler the Creator. Uh, now I'm blanking. Wu-Tang,
Sure.
Nas, like dipping into the various aspects, and I had seen the variant covers, and so I was like, probably about 18 or so, maybe a little bit older, but that was the first reason that I had to actually go into my comic shop. And I was talking to them and I was like, I don't really know a whole lot about what's going on here, but I do want this Squirrel Girl uh cover because it
Right.
has Tyler the Creator's
Yeah.
album
It was the
homage
wolf
on it.
cover. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And so that it's like such a weird and niche thing that would be like the inciting incident for me being obsessed with comics. But that moment and seeing that online, that the variants were out there, it made me look up my local comic shops. And, from there, building a relationship with those people over time. But I would have never entered a comic shop if it wasn't for those variant covers, which is like, you know,
That's
it's
awesome.
it's very cyclical, but that
Yeah,
aspect just really was I was obsessed with it. So I'm so glad that you were, a part of just about me coming back to comics after, so many years.
man, that's great to hear. That was, the dream, right? That we were getting people into shops. I mean, they were big sellers, but they were just selling to folks who were not, like you like just had the same who had a very similar story to yours, where this was getting them back into shops, or for the first time, if not back into, all right.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, so those are awesome. Those were a blast to do, and there's I think they're kind of impossible to find. But if you're hearing about this for the first time and you're curious, there were two hardcover collections. So if you just wanted to see them, those are out there for anybody who's like, what's this? How's this work?
Well,
That's an easy way to just jump in and see what's up.
well, well, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me and talking about the book and everything associated. Um, for the people that want to follow you, I'll obviously put the stuff down below, but where can they find you?
Sure, I'm on social media. I'm on Blue Sky. The Twitter account is there for the moment, or X account, whatever. Instagram, I'm probably most active because it requires much less of me. So I just like can post something that's going on or I'm working on. So that's Robinson, Chris Robinson. It's just my name, first name, last name. Oh, sorry, last name, first name, last name. Um, I have if anybody is listening to this and you're into Kickstarter, that's probably where you want to be aware. Follow me there, because that's where this project originated, and a lot of my other projects start there before they go anywhere else. So that's probably the best place to find me: Instagram and Kickstarter.
Well, that'll be great. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on, and for everybody listening, go read some comics.